It began, as most of Flaxborough's mysteries did, with something that ought to have been funny. Mrs. Ethel Rudge, a widow of 72 with a voice like a creaking wardrobe and a passion for chrysanthemums, stood at the centre of the Women's Institute flower show, pale as milk, insisting that her mirror had refused to show her face. Her declaration, made between the sponge cake table and the display of home-knit mittens, caused a shudder of silence before the expected merciful laughter began. "Oh, Ethel, don't be daft," said Mrs. Goodacre, chairwoman and professional mocker. "Mirrors can't be choosy." But Mrs. Rudge, who was not a woman inclined to drama, except in her choice of lipstick, simply shook her head. "I looked," she said, "and there was the room behind me clear as day. But my face, it wasn't there." The laughter faltered slightly then. Mrs. Goodacre tittered once more, but uncertainly. The vicar's wife glanced at her husband's entry in the cucumber competition and muttered something about fatigue. Only one person failed to laugh at all. Young Miss Larkin, who served tea in the church hall on Thursdays and had been seen weeping at brief encounter for the 5th time last week. She looked at Mrs. Rudge with soft, alarmed eyes, as though vanity itself might be contagious. Later that evening, Mrs. Rudge returned to her home, a narrow Edwardian villa on Mint Street, where the brass letterbox gleamed and the curtains met like conspirators. Her housekeeper, a capable woman named Hester Blunt, had prepared the supper tray and withdrawn. By 10 o'clock, the gas fire hissed gently, the radio murmured about continental politics, and Mrs. Rudge stood again before her dressing-table mirror. It was a handsome piece, gilt frame, oval, imported from France by her late husband. Beneath the lamplight it reflected everything: the room, the lace doily, even the faint steam from her teacup. Everything except her. She blinked. The image did not change. Her body's outline was faintly there, but her face remained a pale blur, as though the glass had gone blind. A small brittle sound escaped her throat, half gasp, half prayer. She turned away, then looked again. Still nothing. The next morning, Mrs. Blunt found her employer seated in the parlour, pale and determined. "The mirror," she said calmly, "must go. It's bewitched, or worse." Mrs. Blunt, who had worked for her since 1957, did not argue. But later that afternoon she mentioned the incident to her cousin's husband, who happened to sell curiosities at the Saturday market, and from there, by way of the post office queue, the butcher's counter, and a particularly talkative librarian, the tale spread. By tea-time, the town was divided into two camps, those who believed Mrs. Rudge had suffered a funny turn, and those who suspected something queer in that mirror. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was taking no interest in mirrors at all. He was engaged in the slow business of reading the council's new traffic regulations, which, as he explained to Sergeant Love, appeared to have been drafted by someone who hated both cars and sentences. It was Love who brought him the news. "Bit of an odd one, sir." "Oh, Mrs. Rudge says her mirror's gone funny. Wouldn't show her face, and now it's missing altogether." Purbright, who seldom dismissed oddities too quickly, raised an eyebrow. "Missing?" "Yes, sir. Gone this morning. Housekeeper says it was there last night, vanished by dawn. No sign of forced entry." Purbright closed the folder on the traffic bylaws with the air of a man grateful for interruption. "Then I suppose we'd better go and see whether the mirror walked off of its own accord." By late afternoon, they were in Mint Street. The Rudge house was prim, symmetrical, and faintly ashamed of its own curtains. Mrs. Blunt received them with an air of martyrdom. "She's upstairs, sir." "Won't go near the room," Purbright nodded. "Best not to disturb her more than necessary. You say the mirror was a family piece?" "Her late husband's. She polished it every Thursday like clockwork." "And you noticed nothing unusual?" Mrs. Blunt hesitated, only that she'd been talking to it lately. Quietly, mind, as if expecting an answer. Purbright's face remained neutral. Indeed. The mirror, or where it had been, left a clean patch on the wallpaper, a small oval of brightness like the ghost of light that lingers after lightning. Sergeant Love examined the lock, the sill, and the carpet with unconvincing enthusiasm. "It looks like someone just lifted it off and walked out." Purbright gazed at the empty wall. "Possibly," he murmured, "though I wonder if the theft came after the disappearance. Or before." "Before what, sir?" "Before the lady vanished from the glass," said Purbright softly. Love frowned. "Meaning, sir," Purbright smiled faintly, "meaning, Sergeant, that in Flaxborough even reflections have reputations to maintain." He took one last look at the pale patch on the wall, then at the dainty perfume bottle on the table. The faint scent of lavender hung in the air, not unpleasant, but oddly theatrical, as though someone had tried to mask another odour entirely. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the brass letters of Rudge upon the gate. They gleamed with what might almost have been pride. By breakfast time the next morning, Mrs. Rudge's mirror had become the most discussed object in Flaxborough since the unveiling of the new traffic roundabout, and, by most accounts, infinitely more mysterious. In the snug of the Royal George, over tea that was technically gin, Mr. Horace Waddy declared that he had never trusted a woman who owns more than one looking-glass. His companion, Miss Cora Tiddy, manageress of the haberdashery and an unrepentant spreader of information, replied that she wouldn't trust one who talks to it. At precisely the same moment, in the post office queue, Mrs. Brindle was informing anyone within range that the mirror showed nothing because it was ashamed of what it saw. The Reverend Prowse, hearing this third hand through his wife, privately concluded that the devil had a hand in it, though he refrained from saying so aloud, lest it lead to a vestry debate about the use of mirrors at the harvest fair. By 11 o'clock, the story had multiplied like a rumour does when given tea, sugar, and an audience. Some said the mirror had cracked itself rather than show its owner's face. Others, that Mrs. Rudge had seen someone else looking out from it. Inspector Purbright, in his quiet office above the police station, was leafing through the morning reports when Sergeant Love arrived, full of relish and crumbs. "Morning, sir. The mirror business has grown legs. Everyone in town's talking about it." Purbright glanced up mildly. "Then we must assume it's halfway to retirement already. What have we got?" Love consulted his notebook. "No sign of forced entry as we thought. The back door's bolted, windows all secure. Mrs. Blunt says she slept sound, though she did hear the grandfather clock strike 3 in an odd sort of way." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Has the clock confessed yet?" Love ignored this. Neighbours didn't see anyone, except Mrs. Appleyard across the street, who claims she heard a vehicle of some kind between 2 and 3. Then there's the postman, who says Mrs. Rudge's front steps smelled of turpentine this morning. "Turpentine?" Purbright repeated, intrigued. "That's unusual." "Unless Mrs. Rudge has taken up painting self-portraits," Love grinned. "Wouldn't surprise me, sir, after all this mirror talk." Purbright closed the file he had been pretending to read. "Well, Sergeant, we must decide whether we're dealing with theft, delusion, or a very elaborate joke. And since this is Flaxborough, all three remain possible." That afternoon, Purbright decided that information in Flaxborough travelled most efficiently through 3 channels: hair salons, funeral parlours, and tea rooms. Lacking an immediate reason to visit the other 2, he began with Mrs. Frobisher's Salon Elegante. The interior was a blend of pink vinyl and optimism. Beneath a row of humming dryers sat 3 women and enough speculation to power a small generator. "Morning, Inspector," called Mrs. Frobisher, whose enthusiasm was exceeded only by her understanding of confidentiality. "Come to have a trim, or just an update?" Purbright smiled faintly. "A little of both, perhaps." He listened, with the patience of a man accustomed to extracting diamonds from gravel. As the ladies rehearsed the entire affair, "Mrs. Rudge looked perfectly well last week," said one. She was talking to that antiques man again, added another. Mr. Sprod from the arcade. He's a sly one, murmured a third. That name caught Purbright's ear. Sprod, he repeated casually. Would that be Almeric Sprod, dealer in decorative bric-a-brac? That's him, said Mrs. Frobisher, applying lacquer to a helmet of curls. Been sniffing round widows for years, poor lamb. Buys their ornaments, sells 'em dear in Lincoln. Purbright thanked them with sincere civility, paid for a non-existent trim, and left. Outside, he found Sergeant Love waiting by the patrol car, eating a sausage roll with devotion. Sir, said Love, Mrs. Rudge's housekeeper mentioned a visitor yesterday afternoon. A gentleman she didn't know. Left before 5. Could be this Sprod, or could be someone else entirely, murmured Purbright. In Flaxborough, visitors often arrive under one name and depart under another. He looked down the street, where the faint drizzle gave everything a varnished melancholy. Let's see if Mr. Sprod is at home. The Antiques Arcade was a narrow shop wedged between a tobacconist and a shop that sold nothing anyone had wanted since 1932. It smelled of beeswax and polite deception. Almeric Sprod was a wiry man in a waistcoat, 2 decades too young for him, with the furtive charm of someone who could sell a cracked teapot as a relic of the Great Exhibition. Ah, Inspector, he said, eyes bright with guiltless curiosity. Come about that dreadful business with poor Mrs. Rudge's mirror, I suppose. Terrible thing. You've heard? Of course, of course. All town's abuzz. I only hope the dear lady recovers her composure. Lovely piece, that mirror. French, late 19th century. I sold it to her husband myself, indeed. Purbright examined a shelf of porcelain dogs. And you've not seen it since? Sprod's expression became a study in innocence. Oh, good heavens, no. Not since old Mr. Rudge passed on. Mrs. Blunt says you called yesterday. The man's eyelids flickered. Merely on business. I'd heard she was considering parting with some of the silver. I left a card. Purbright nodded as if accepting the explanation. And did you see the mirror while you were there? Sprod hesitated. Briefly, yes. Still on her dressing table. Remarkable object, that. They say you could see more than your face in it. Your soul, perhaps. He smiled weakly. Not that I'd know anything about that. Quite, said Purbright. And what time did you leave? Oh, just before 5. Why? No reason. Purbright turned toward the door. Thank you for your time, Mr. Sprod. I dare say we'll speak again. As they walked back to the car, Love said, You don't believe him, sir? Purbright watched the shopfront's reflection in the drizzle-darkened pavement. I seldom believe anyone, Sergeant. It saves embarrassment later. That evening the gossip reached its crescendo at the library reading group. Miss Tiddy, fortified by sherry, proposed that the mirror was a portal. Mrs. Brindle countered that it was simply worn out from reflecting sin. The vicar's wife found both views reasonable. Upstairs in Mint Street, Mrs. Rudge sat by her bed in candlelight. The empty space on the wall glowed faintly like a wound healing over. She whispered, You took my face. What will you do with it now? Outside, unseen, a car idled briefly and drove away. At the police station, Purbright made a single note in his small black book. The town believes in curses. The truth will be duller and crueler. Then he underlined one word. Sprod. And beneath it, smaller, lavender. The following morning dawned with a mist that made Flaxborough look briefly important, as though secrecy itself had descended to hold a meeting. Inspector Purbright, who mistrusted days that began with fog and ended with paperwork, decided to visit Mrs. Rudge in person. He had no warrant, no urgency, and only the mild curiosity that sustained all proper police work in the town. Sergeant Love drove, cheerfully humming an advertising jingle. She's the talk of every breakfast table, sir. Half the town says she's cursed, the other half says she's cracked. Purbright smiled faintly. Perhaps she's simply both, Sergeant. It often saves time. Mint Street looked much as it always did, rows of identical villas, each with its own theory of good taste, The Rudge house, however, seemed quieter today. Not sad exactly, but watchful. Mrs. Blunt, the housekeeper, met them at the door. "She's calmer, sir, but—"
"Strange," Purbright inclined his head.
"Strange in what way, Mrs. Blunt?" "She keeps looking at the wall where it used to hang. Talking low like she's listening for an echo inside. The air smelled of lavender and polish, and of something else, faint but insistent, a metallic tang that didn't belong to domesticity." Purbright paused in the hall, eyes drawn to the vacant patch of wallpaper where the mirror had hung. A faint oval outline remained, like a bruise left by light. "Odd," murmured Purbright. "Sir?"
asked Love. "The way absence decorates more strongly than presence."
"That wall seems louder than the rest of the house." They were shown into the parlour. Mrs. Rudge sat upright in a high-backed chair, a small crocheted blanket across her knees. Her manner was that of a woman determined not to let emotion appear without a formal appointment. "Inspector," she said, with weary precision. "You've come about my mirror, I presume?" Purbright bowed slightly. "If you'll permit me, madam. Sergeant Love and I are here simply to understand what has happened." Mrs. Rudge's gaze drifted toward the window.
"It's gone."
"And not just the glass. It took something with it. You'll say I'm foolish, but I can feel the absence like a draught." Purbright sat gently opposite her. "I find foolishness rare, Mrs. Rudge, and never where people claim it." A faint smile touched her lips. "You speak kindly, Inspector. That's dangerous in your profession." "I've been warned," he said mildly. There was silence for a moment. The hush of old furniture.
"Old money and old secrets, tell me," Purbright said softly.
"When did you last see it as it should be?"
"The day before yesterday. I was dressing for the Institute show."
"I remember brushing my hair, and there it was, clear as ever. Then, later that afternoon, I looked again and—" Her voice trailed off. "And—"
"I was gone," she said quietly.
"The room was there, the dresser, the curtain, even the door behind me. But I was not."
"Only a blur, like mist. I thought it a trick of the light."
"But when it happened again, I knew it was deliberate." "Deliberate, madam?" "Yes, as if it refused me." Sergeant Love shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Purbright, who betrayed no reaction. "Did you notice anything else unusual?" Mrs. Rudge frowned, searching memory. "Yes, the scent of turpentine, faint but sharp."
"I thought Hester had been cleaning, but she swore she hadn't." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "Turpentine."
"That would suggest paint, perhaps. Has the mirror ever been restored, repaired, or—" "It was rebacked after the war," she said. "My husband had it done in Lincoln. He said the old silvering had tarnished, but it's been sound ever since." Purbright rose and walked to the empty wall. The wallpaper showed a rectangle slightly cleaner than its surroundings. He bent closer, noting the faint outline of a handprint. No more than a dust shadow, perhaps. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "fetch me a torch." Love produced the small torch he kept for moments when real detective work was demanded. The beam skimmed across the plaster. Something glimmered faintly, a streak of residue, colourless but sticky. "Resin, perhaps," murmured Purbright. "Or varnish." He turned back to Mrs. Rudge. "Have you lent or sold any items recently?" She looked almost offended. "Certainly not. My things are my memories, Inspector."
"They don't go wandering," Purbright inclined his head. "No visitors then, no, aside from Mr. Sprod?"
Her expression tightened, a fine crack of distaste. Mr. Sprod called yes.
"I do not encourage him."
"He smells faintly of profit." "You didn't show him the mirror?"
"I did not."
"But he asked after it. Said he could fetch a fair price if I ever wished to part with it." Purbright smiled gently.
"And what did you reply?"
"That he could fetch a better price selling his conscience, if he could find a buyer." Sergeant Love choked discreetly on a cough. Purbright straightened his hat.
"A very sound remark, madam." Mrs. Rudge's eyes softened suddenly.
"Inspector, may I tell you something odd? The last time the mirror did show me, that morning before the flower show, I thought I saw someone else behind me, a shape almost like a man standing in the hall. But when I turned, There was no one there. Purbright regarded her closely. Did it resemble anyone you know?
I couldn't say. It felt familiar.
Yet not from now.
As if the mirror remembered more than I did. When they left, the fog had thinned to a faint drizzle. Love closed his notebook.
Well, sir, that was a nice friendly chat, and about as helpful as a chocolate teapot. Purbright said nothing for a moment. Then, tell me, Sergeant, what's the one thing we've heard twice? Love frowned. Twice?
Turpentine?
Exactly.
And one doesn't polish mirrors with it.
One removes paint or perhaps disguises repairs. You think someone was painting in there? Purbright looked back toward the dim outline of the Rudge house. No, Sergeant.
I think someone was altering something.
Perhaps not paint, but a surface, and the way one might resurface truth itself. Love looked baffled, but dutiful. As they drove off, Purbright scribbled a short note in his little book. Turpentine, scent of correction. Mirror last rebacked in Lincoln. He closed the book.
Sergeant, ring up Lincoln, will you?
Find out who resilvered mirrors in the late 40s, Love nodded. What are we looking for, sir? Purbright gazed through the misted window at the blurred reflections of the shop fronts. Someone, he said quietly, who knows how to make a person vanish politely. The mist of the previous morning had not entirely left Flaxborough. It simply decided to linger in people's minds instead. At the police station, the day began as most did, with Sergeant Love complaining about coffee and Purbright quietly solving 2 administrative mysteries before 9 o'clock. Why the constable's bicycle was missing, lent to the curate's nephew, and why the mayor's dog had received a parking ticket, technically justified. But beneath these civil absurdities, the matter of the Rudge mirror continued to glimmer faintly, like something shiny dropped into a pond. "Sir," said Love, entering with the day's post and his usual air of dietary remorse, "I've been asking around about mirror silvering in Lincoln. Only one firm still about that was working back then, Pickard and Loam, Decorative Restorations. Old chap there remembers doing a batch of gilt-framed pieces for a Mr. Rudge, Flaxborough, sometime around 48. Purbright looked up from his teacup. 48, the year Mr. Rudge bought his French mirror. Did he say who delivered or collected the order? Some assistant of theirs, a young lad back then. Chap can't remember his name, but says he'd gone into trade himself later on. Might be our Mr. Sprod, sir." Purbright smiled slightly. "The past is a rather small place, isn't it?" "Especially here," said Love. "Everyone seems to know everyone's secrets before they've finished having them." Before Purbright could reply, the telephone on his desk rang with the delicate authority of a parish scandal. He listened for a moment,
Murmured politenesses, then replaced the receiver.
"That," he said, "was Mrs. Appleyard, who lives across from Mrs. Rudge. She believes she saw a man leaving the Rudge house the night the mirror vanished." "Middle of the night?" "2:30. She was apparently up checking on her cat." Love raised an eyebrow. "Likely story." "In Flaxborough, Sergeant," said Purbright dryly, "most nocturnal activities are blamed on pets. Come, we'll go hear her version firsthand. Mrs. Appleyard, a widow of brisk temperament and startlingly direct gaze, met them at her door in a mauve housecoat that suggested a personality both thrifty and unyielding. I said to myself, 'Inspector, I'd best call you,'" she began, "because one can't have people creeping about Mint Street at that hour. Not with the standards we've tried to maintain." Purbright inclined his head.
"Quite so, madam. You saw someone near Mrs. Rudge's house?"
"Leaving it," she said firmly. 2:45, maybe a bit later.
"I was in the front room. My pudding had been sick. And I saw movement. A man, tallish, hat on,
Walked right out of her gate carrying something long and narrow, like a picture frame. Did you recognize him?"
Couldn't swear to it.
He moved quickly and didn't look up, but I'd say he wasn't young. He walked with purpose, though.
Not a thief sort of shuffle. Describe him as best you can. Well? She squinted toward the memory.
Long coat, dark.
Hat brim turned down.
I remember thinking he looked like a gentleman who'd just done something he didn't want to think about. Did he carry the object carefully or carelessly?
Asked Purbright. Oh, careful as could be, said Mrs. Appleyard, like it mattered to him. Purbright nodded thoughtfully.
Thank you, madam. You've been most helpful. As they walked back to the car, Love said, Could be Sprod again, sir. He fits the not young, sly as an eel description. Purbright didn't answer immediately. He stood looking back at the quiet row of houses, the thin chimneys leaning into the grey sky. Perhaps, he said finally. But thieves in Flaxborough rarely move with purpose. They usually trip over their intentions halfway. Later that afternoon, Purbright and Love paid a second visit to the Antiques Arcade. Mr. Sprod, seeing them enter, managed an expression of surprise that might have fooled anyone who hadn't seen him rehearse it daily. Inspector?
Sergeant, to what do I owe the pleasure, or the anxiety?
Purbright smiled politely. We've been speaking to some of Mrs. Rudge's neighbours. It seems someone fitting your general description was seen leaving her premises very late the other night. Mine? Sprod blinked.
Good heavens, I was in bed by 11. Ask my landlady if you like. She's nosy enough to know. I may, said Purbright. Though I'd hate to disturb her if she's still digesting last week's gossip. Sprod gave a weak chuckle. You don't think I had anything to do with that silly mirror story, surely?
I try not to think, Mr. Sprod, said Purbright mildly. It prejudices the evidence. He let his gaze wander about the shop. The endless ranks of china dogs, tarnished frames, and faded portraits of people long unbothered by police questions. Then his eyes settled on a gilt oval frame leaning against the counter, empty of glass. Interesting piece, he said. Oh, that? Sprod bent quickly. Just a damaged frame, came in with a batch from an estate sale. Haven't had time to fit it with new glass. Purbright's tone remained conversational. A frame of similar size to Mrs. Rudge's mirror, I'd say, though perhaps older. Sprod laughed nervously.
Coincidence, Inspector. Of course, said Purbright.
Coincidences are the chief export of Flaxborough. He left a moment later, after an exchange of bland pleasantries. Outside, Love muttered, He's guilty as sin, sir. Possibly, said Purbright, or he's simply unlucky enough to sell nostalgia in a town that buys only malice. That evening, Purbright reviewed his notes. Witness, Mrs. Appleyard, credible, if fond of adjectives. Sprod, evasive but not yet slippery enough. Mrs. Rudge, frightened, but of what? He drew a small diagram of the Rudge house and marked the mirror's former place. Then, without conscious thought, he jotted a question beside it. What else vanished? At that moment, Sergeant Love entered, holding a small parcel. From Mrs. Blunt, sir. She found it in a drawer under the dressing table. Said it didn't belong to Mrs. Rudge. Purbright opened the brown paper carefully. Inside lay a folded cloth and a small object wrapped in tissue. He unrolled it, a fragment of glass, no bigger than a postage stamp, silvered on one side, faintly warped on the other, with a single fingerprint blurred across it. Purbright held it up to the light. The reflected image of his own face, stretched and curved, seemed to smile where he did not. Where exactly was this found?
In the drawer, sir.
Beneath some handkerchiefs. She says she's never seen it before. Purbright placed the fragment gently on his blotter. And I think, Sergeant, we've found what's left of the gentleman Mrs. Appleyard didn't quite see. Love blinked.
You mean?
Purbright gave a faint smile. Not yet. But, let's just say, whoever took the mirror left behind something that didn't wish to go with it. For a few days, the business of Mrs. Rudge's missing mirror appeared to fade into the general gossip of the town, absorbed, as all scandals eventually were, into the polite sediment of local conversation. But in Inspector Purbright's office, the case lingered like the faint smell of lavender that had once hung in the Rudge parlour. He regarded the fragment of glass found in the dressing-table drawer, now sealed in a brown envelope. It was not evidence precisely, more a question in solid form, a piece too small to explain anything, yet too deliberate to be accident. Sir, said Sergeant Love, bringing in the morning's correspondence. "We've had word from Lincoln. That restoration firm, Pickard and Loam, kept records. They're sending copies of their 1948 orders, including the one for Mr. Rudge. Apparently the assistant who did the collection went into business later, under his own name. Not Sprod." Love grinned. "No, sir. Fellow named Thomas Venn died a few years ago. Left behind a daughter still in Lincoln, Mrs. Sybil Gant. Lives above a little art shop." Purbright leaned back, fingertips together.
Art runs in the family, then?
"Possibly the moral kind, possibly not." He turned to the window where the October light had all the conviction of a neglected conscience. "We'll visit Mrs. Rudge again. There's something still unsaid in that house." Mrs. Blunt received them with her usual air of domestic martyrdom. "She's brighter today, sir. Been sorting photographs for the mantelpiece." Purbright nodded. "May we disturb her sorting?" The drawing-room was scented again with lavender, though now mixed with furniture wax and a hint of gilt. Mrs. Rudge sat surrounded by photo albums, her fingers moving slowly through the past. "Inspector," she said, her tone calmer, almost wistful, "you find me in sentimental mood. One can't lose one's reflection without wondering who, precisely, one has been." "Indeed," said Purbright. "May we look at your photographs?" "If you wish. They're nothing of importance. Just the usual faces people make when they still believe in permanence." Purbright began leafing through an album marked 1940-1950. The pages held a parade of proper smiles, seaside hats, and the sort of formality that suggested everyone had been told not to blink. Then, halfway through, a small photograph caught his eye. Mrs. Rudge, 10 years younger, stood before her dressing table, beside her late husband, who was adjusting his tie. Between them, in the oval of the mirror, the room was reflected clearly. But the reflection showed something peculiar. Instead of mirroring the scene precisely, the image contained an extra figure, a blurred young woman, standing in the background where no one should have been. Her features were indistinct, but her outline suggested youth and confidence. Purbright tapped the photograph lightly. "Miss Rudge, may I ask who this is?" She peered closely, then frowned.
"That's odd."
"There was no one else in the room that day. My husband set the camera on a timer."
"That must be a smudge or a fault in the film." "Perhaps," said Purbright.
"Though film faults seldom wear shoes," Love leaned in. "Looks like a person to me, sir."
"Maybe the maid."
"Different uniform," said Purbright softly.
"And no maid keeps her hair like that. That's vanity, not service." Mrs. Rudge looked uneasy.
"I assure you, Inspector, we were alone, and I'd rather not dwell on old superstitions. The mirror has caused enough distress, of course," said Purbright, closing the album. "It's only a curiosity." But as they took their leave, Purbright carried the faint unease of that third figure in his mind. Not as a ghost, but as an error of memory too precise to be accident. On their way back to the station, Love said, "You don't think it's supernatural, do you, sir?" Purbright's reply was patient. "No, Sergeant. The supernatural is rarely half as strange as human nature. People forget, embellish, conceal, all with the tidy earnestness of someone rearranging furniture before a guest arrives. So what's our next step? Here we find Mrs. Sybil Gant in Lincoln. She may know more about how Mr. Rudge came to own a mirror that reflects what it chooses." Love grinned.
"And maybe she can tell us who the ghostly lady is." Purbright smiled faintly.
"Ghosts are useful only while they're unexplained.
Once you identify them, they're just relatives."
2 days later, Mrs. Sybil Gant proved to be a brisk, angular woman of 50, with spectacles that seemed designed for interrogation. Her shop smelled of varnish and picture frames. "Thomas Venn was my father," she said, after Purbright's introduction. "He did silvering work for years."
"Fine craftsman."
"Could bring a dead mirror back to life. Did he ever mention the Rudge Commission?" She nodded. "Yes. I remember him saying the man, Mr. Rudge, always wanted something special, a rebacking with an extra layer of silver. To make the image last longer, he said. Father didn't think much of it, but took the job. He was a practical man. Purbright considered this, Would such a treatment change how a mirror reflects?
It could, she said.
Too much silvering can make a reflection oddly
Shallow, you see the surface, not the depth. My father said it looked like the glass was pretending to be honest. Purbright smiled.
a quality not confined to mirrors, Mrs. Gant chuckled. Indeed, he told me one more thing, that the client had brought his own backing cloth, said it was sentimental from his wife's family. Father didn't ask further. Purbright felt a small spark in the fog. This cloth, did he describe it? Green damask, embroidered with initials, E.V. Ethel Venn, asked Purbright. Mrs. Gant blinked. Why, yes, my grandmother's name. She died before I was born. Why? Purbright's voice was soft. Because Mrs. Rudge's maiden name, according to our files, was also Venn. Driving back toward Flaxborough, Sergeant Love was first to speak. So Mrs. Rudge and your mirror man's mother were related? Almost certainly, said Purbright. Which means Mr. Rudge's purchase of that mirror wasn't an accident. He may have been buying a family piece, or silencing one. Love looked impressed.
You think he covered up some family scandal?
Purbright's smile was faint. Scandal is too big a word for most of what people hide, Sergeant.
Usually it's only embarrassment with better handwriting. He took the small photograph from his pocket again, studying the blurred woman's shape in the reflection. That girl isn't a ghost.
She's a memory that someone tried to remove. Back in his office, Purbright placed the photograph beside the envelope containing the glass fragment. Under the desk lamp, the silvered shard gleamed dully, and in its warped reflection he fancied he saw the same soft outline of a woman's face, fading just as he looked. He closed the envelope slowly.
Sergeant, he said, we're not chasing a thief. We're chasing an editor. An editor, sir?
Yes, said Purbright. Someone who prefers their version of the past to anyone
else's. The next morning,
found Inspector Purbright studying a small genealogical diagram he had drawn. On his notepad, a modest tangle of names joined by uncertain lines. At the centre sat Ethel Venn, Mrs. Rudge, and beside her, in brackets, Thomas Venn, deceased, mirror restorer. Between them ran a dotted line marked with a simple question. Siblings. Sergeant Love entered, balancing tea and optimism. Morning, sir.
I've been through the probate registry like you asked. Mr. Rudge's will left everything to his wife. No children, no nieces, no second cousins hiding in the shrubbery. Straightforward as a sermon. Most sermons, murmured Purbright, are straightforward until you listen closely. Love grinned.
You think there's more to it? Purbright tapped the notepad. If Mrs. Rudge's maiden name was Venn, and her husband bought that mirror from a Venn workshop in Lincoln, it may not have been commerce at all.
It may have been reclamation or suppression. Suppression of what?
Something reflected once and best forgotten. To untangle wills and memories, Purbright next paid a visit to Mr. Morris Blee, solicitor and reluctant custodian of Flaxborough's legal decorum. Blee's office smelled faintly of paper, port, and evasions. He rose from behind his desk with the cheer of a man paid to endure clients rather than greet them. Inspector, always a pleasure. You'll forgive the chaos. One never realizes how many people die untidily until one keeps their files. Purbright inclined his head. It's the Rudge estate that interests me. Nothing untidy there, I hope? Blee adjusted his spectacles.
Oh, Mrs. Rudge's late husband. No, a model client.
Dealt entirely in clear bequests and good sense. House, effects, investments, all to the widow. No contest, no complications, not even from the family of Mrs. Rudge herself. Blee hesitated fractionally.
Her family?
I was under the impression she had none surviving. Purbright smiled faintly. Impressions are useful things, Mr. Blee. They save one from knowledge. The solicitor coughed lightly.
I may be mistaken, of course.
There was a young woman who wrote once, years ago, claimed to be a cousin, I believe. Wanted to know if Mrs. Rudge might part with an heirloom mirror of family provenance. I advised Mrs. Rudge to ignore it. Purbright's tone remained mild.
And did she?
I should assume so. I heard nothing more. Do you recall the young woman's name? Blee frowned. Ven, I think. Or perhaps Venton. Something of the kind.
Letters long ago, you understand, are preoccupied times. Purbright rose.
Quite so. The past always prefers to remain politely archived. As he left, he noticed a single photograph on the wall behind Blee's desk. A framed image of the Flaxborough Civic Gala, 1953, among the rows of dignitaries. A young Mrs. Rudge stood beside her husband, perfectly composed, and just behind them, almost hidden in shadow, was a familiar figure. Almeric Sprod, younger, thinner, already watchful, back at the station. Love was waiting with his usual mixture of curiosity and pastry. Sir, you might like this. Bit of gossip from the postmistress. Says Mrs. Rudge used to get letters from Lincoln every spring. Always the same handwriting, same lavender envelopes. Stopped about 2 years ago. Lavender, repeated Purbright softly. That's sent again. He opened his notebook.
Sergeant, do you believe in coincidence? Love thought.
Only when it's inconvenient, sir. Good answer. Purbright turned a page. Now, if those letters came from Lincoln, perhaps from our Mrs. Gant or someone near her, find out whether she had family in Flaxborough, particularly a younger relative. Perhaps the cousin Blee mentioned. Love nodded. Right, sir. And the mirror? Purbright looked thoughtful. If I were a sentimental object, Sergeant, I'd hide with someone who cared about me. People rarely steal what they hate. Only what they think belongs to them. That evening, Mrs. Blunt appeared unannounced at the police station, her usual reserve softened by worry. Inspector, I don't like to interfere, but Mrs. Rudge has been acting queer again. Sat staring at that empty wall half the afternoon. Said she heard her father calling. Her father's been gone 40 years, sir. Purbright listened quietly. Has she been receiving visitors?
Only one.
That antiques man again, the Sprod, slipped in just after dark. I told him she was resting, but he said he had to settle a misunderstanding. She let him in. Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly.
And I heard raised voices? Not shouting exactly, but more like pleading.
He left after 20 minutes, looking pale. Said, "Tell her I can't keep it forever." Then he was gone. Purbright closed his notebook. Miss Blunt, you've been most helpful. And you're quite right. Isn't interference. It's observation, the most valuable of human vices. When Love returned an hour later, he found Purbright still at his desk, staring at a sheet of paper covered in neat,
unhurried handwriting. Report from Lincoln, sir.
Yes, Mrs. Gant confirms she has a daughter, one Lucy Ven Gant, 26, works part-time in an art gallery.
Moved recently.
To Flaxborough. Love blinked.
Here in town?
Purbright nodded slowly. Indeed. And before you ask, yes, she's the same young lady who assisted with the civic exhibition last month. The one who catalogued the historical portraits for the mayor's office. I remember her. Bit shy, wears a green coat. Didn't think she'd have anything to do with missing mirrors. Neither did Mrs. Rudge, I imagine, said Purbright. But we found our cousin. 2 mornings later, Miss Lucy Gant, small, fair, and nervously intelligent, arrived at the station of her own accord. I heard you were asking about me, Inspector, she said. It's about my great-aunt's mirror, isn't it? Purbright regarded her gently. You consider Mrs. Rudge your great-aunt? She's my grandmother's sister. They stopped speaking before I was born. My mother always said there was a quarrel over an inheritance. When I moved here for work, I thought perhaps I could make peace. I wrote to her last year. She didn't reply. Did you visit her? I tried once. She sent the maid to the door. Said she didn't receive family without invitation. Understandable, perhaps, said Purbright softly. People who look too long into mirrors prefer solitude. Lucy smiled sadly.
I didn't want her things. I only wanted to see that mirror.
My mother said it was ours by right. It belonged to my great-grandfather's first marriage, before Mrs. Rudge's time. She said my aunt took it when she married Mr. Rudge. Ah, murmured Purbright. Then perhaps the mirror's disappearance isn't theft at all, merely restitution. Her eyes flickered.
You think
I think, said Purbright, that people rarely take what they don't feel already belongs to them. Did you see the mirror recently? She hesitated. Only once, in her window.
I stopped outside one evening and saw my reflection in it. Oh, or I thought I did.
But it looked wrong, older, sadder. I thought it was just the glass. Purbright smiled faintly. Mirrors don't lie, Miss Gaunt. They just choose their moments. When she left, Love turned to him. Do you believe her, sir? Purbright rubbed his chin thoughtfully.
Entirely, Sergeant.
Which is why I suspect she knows far more than she realizes. He wrote a short note on his pad. The mirror has changed hands twice. Sprod knows where it rests. So does guilt. Then leaning back, he said quietly, Tomorrow we'll pay Mr. Sprod another visit. This time I'll ask him to show me his own reflection. Flaxborough, as Inspector Purbright often observed, had an admirable instinct for transforming misfortune into conversation. By midweek, even the milkman had a theory about Mrs. Rudge's missing mirror, though his involved magnetism and the phases of the moon. The police station, meanwhile, had settled into its usual rhythm. Quiet, methodical, faintly resentful of excitement. That calm was broken at 10 o'clock when Sergeant Love entered, clutching a sheaf of papers and a face that suggested both relish and disbelief. Sir, we've got another one. Another what? Asked Purbright without looking up from his tea. Burglary, sort of. The solicitor, Mr. Blee, says someone broke into his office last night.
Only nothing's missing. Purbright looked up now, one eyebrow raised.
Nothing?
Not so much as a paperclip.
He's shaken, though. Says his desk was opened, and the cabinet where he keeps wills and deeds.
Only one file out of place, Mrs. Rudge's. Ah, murmured Purbright.
Our old friend Coincidence has returned, wearing slightly thicker shoes. They arrived at Blee's office half an hour later. The solicitor was waiting, immaculate as always, but with a nervous sheen to his politeness. I assure you, Inspector, I've never known such a thing. Nothing stolen, no damage, just drawers opened, as though whoever it was knew exactly what they wanted and then thought better of it. Purbright surveyed the room. The lock on the filing cabinet bore faint scratches, neat and professional. Did you keep duplicates of Mrs. Rudge's papers? Blee shook his head. Only one copy of the will and correspondence. It was all here. Purbright ran a finger along the edge of the open drawer. Perhaps the visitor didn't want to steal, only to look. Look? Yes, curiosity can be more invasive than greed. Blee blinked. You think they were after information? I think, said Purbright mildly, they were after reassurance. Someone wanted to confirm what Mrs. Rudge did, or didn't, leave behind. Love was prowling the office like a hopeful dog.
Sir, look at this. He pointed to a faint smear on the corner of the desk blotter.
Paint, white with a bit of gilt dust. Same sort of thing you'd get off an old picture frame. Purbright regarded it thoughtfully. So our invisible visitor came bearing art supplies. How very civic-minded. Back at the station, Purbright spent the afternoon with his little notebook, drawing lines between names, Rudge, Sprod, Blee, Lucy Gant. He wrote quietly beneath them, motives, money, guilt, inheritance, identity. By 4 o'clock, Mrs. Blunt telephoned again, her voice tight.
Inspector, I hate to trouble you, but Mrs. Rudge is taken ill.
Nothing serious, but she's been saying odd things again. She asked if her husband's picture still knew the truth. Purbright's tone softened. Which picture? The one above the mantel, sir. Their wedding portrait. When Purbright and Love arrived at Mint Street, the curtains were half drawn, and the house felt heavy with memory. Mrs. Rudge sat in her chair, pale but composed, a teacup trembling in her hand. I suppose you've heard about the solicitor, she said faintly.
Poor man.
He's been guarding ghosts for years. Now one's paid a visit. You've been unwell, madam? Only tired. Dreams again. Dreams? She looked up slowly.
Of my father.
He used to tell me that mirrors were dangerous, that they never forgot the faces they'd seen. He said a lie told in front of one was twice recorded, once in memory, once in glass. Purbright regarded her gently. And what lie was told before yours? Mrs. Rudge gave a small, helpless laugh. So many, Inspector. My husband was a kind man, but not a truthful one. He married me for connection, not love, and he brought that mirror into the house to prove something, or perhaps to hide it. Hide what? She hesitated, eyes bright with tears that refused to fall, a past he didn't wish reflected. After she had rested, Purbright wandered into the parlour again. The portrait of the late Mr. Rudge hung above the mantel, a respectable gentleman, self-satisfied, his wife painted smaller beside him, as though modesty required proportion. Purbright's attention fixed not on the faces but on the background, where, faintly rendered in oil, stood the dressing table and the oval mirror itself. He leaned closer. The painter had captured reflections with surprising accuracy. Yet within the mirror's painted oval, barely visible beneath varnish, there seemed to be another figure again, the blurred shape of a young woman. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "take a note." The mirror was reflecting a third person even then. Love looked startled.
"In the painting, sir?"
Yes, either a whim of the artist or a memory someone insisted be preserved. Could that be our mysterious girl from the photo? Purbright smiled faintly.
"It could."
And if so, Mrs. Rudge has been sharing her home with a likeness of her husband's secret for 30 years. The next morning, Love returned from an errand to Sprod's shop, looking unusually pleased with himself. "Sir, I've found something interesting. Sprod's closed up early today, but his assistant let me in. Guess what's hanging in his back room?" Purbright looked up from his desk. "Surprise me, a mirror, oval, gilt frame."
"Wrapped in cloth. Green damask cloth, embroidered with initials EV." Purbright's expression did not change, though his eyes brightened.
"Our missing friend has found a temporary address, then. Do we bring it in?" "Not yet. Let's see who visits it first." That night, Purbright arranged a quiet watch outside the Antiques arcade. He and Love sat in the unlit patrol car, the street empty except for the occasional cat and the comforting glow of disreputable street lamps. At 11:30, a figure appeared, cloaked, deliberate, female. She glanced once around, then used a small key to unlock the shop door. Love whispered, "That's her, Miss Gant." Purbright nodded. As expected. Let's see what honesty looks like when it thinks it's unobserved. Through the shop window, they saw her unwrap the mirror with careful hands. She touched the frame almost reverently, then turned it toward herself. For a moment, her reflection was visible, pale, tearful, utterly still. Then she covered it again and sat down, shoulders shaking. After a minute, she took from her coat a small envelope and slid it behind the mirror's backing. Then she rose and left as quietly as she had come. Love exhaled. "So that's who took it?" "Yes," said Purbright. "But not why." When they entered the shop later with Sprod's reluctant permission, Purbright removed the envelope carefully. Inside was a folded photograph, the same one Mrs. Rudge had shown them, but untouched by age. The woman in the mirror this time was perfectly clear. It was the same young woman smiling faintly, standing behind the Rudges, and the signature at the bottom read, "To my sister Ethel." From Thomas. Purbright's eyes lingered on it a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Sergeant, our mirror has never shown ghosts.
Only reminders.
And now it's begun to reflect the truth." Inspector Purbright had learned long ago that truth, like light, was least revealing when too bright. It was best seen indirectly, in reflections, hesitations, and the brief moments when people mistook silence for sympathy. For 2 days after the incident at Sprod's shop, he said little to anyone. Sergeant Love, whose patience was more energetic than enduring, spent the interval oscillating between curiosity and indigestion. Finally, on Thursday morning, Purbright invited him into the office. "Sergeant," he began mildly, "do you recall our late-night visitor to the antiques shop, Miss Gant?"
"Aye, sir. Can't say I blame her. Poor girl looked like she was burying her own conscience." Purbright smiled faintly. Conscience is like a mirror, Sergeant.
Useful only until it cracks. He laid the recovered photograph on the desk. Look closely. The inscription, "To my sister Ethel," from Thomas. That means Mrs. Rudge's brother gave her the mirror originally, not her husband. When Mr. Rudge bought it in Lincoln after the war, he was merely buying back what she had once owned. Love frowned. Then why all the secrecy? Because, said Purbright, the mirror carried more than its reflection. It carried memory, but one Mr. Rudge found inconvenient. Perhaps he discovered that his wife's brother had given her the mirror before her marriage. Perhaps it held some family likeness, a young woman whose existence contradicted his tidy version of events. The portrait above the mantel, the photograph, the reflection, they all show a third presence in that household.
One who shouldn't have been there, yet was. Love looked mystified but respectful. You think there was another woman, sir?
Purbright's gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the October afternoon sagged under a grey sky that seemed to have mislaid its ambitions. Not another woman, he said softly.
Another child?
Perhaps born before wedlock, or from another marriage entirely. A small scandal once, a forgotten sin now. The kind of thing people spend lives pretending didn't happen. He turned the photograph over. When the mirror refused to show the Mrs. Rudge her face, it wasn't supernatural petulance. It was her own mind, confronting something it had long suppressed. Love shifted uneasily. You make it sound like the thing thinks, sir. Not thinks, said Purbright. Reminds. Some objects acquire too much memory. They turn accusatory. He closed the folder. Meanwhile, Mr. Blee's office was rifled to check the will. Miss Gant came back for the mirror, not to sell it, but to hide the evidence of that relationship. Sprod, naturally, is the middleman of the muddle, driven by greed, guilt, or both. Love scratched his head. And what do we do now? We invite the guilty to explain themselves, said Purbright calmly. But first, we give them a chance to lie politely. That afternoon, Purbright walked alone through the town. He liked Flaxborough best at 4 o'clock, the hour when the respectable grew restless, and the disreputable hadn't yet stretched their consciences. Every shop window, every curtain, every reflective surface seemed to hold some small echo of human vanity. He paused at a puddle outside the butcher's, shallow, perfect, reflecting the cloudy sky. A small boy stamped in it, scattering the reflection entirely. Purbright smiled to himself. A theologian, he murmured. In the Royal George, over weak coffee, he took out his notebook and began to write. Not facts now, but reflections. People polish their pasts as they polish silver, until the truth gleams.
Or disappears. Mrs. Rudge sees absence because...
She cannot bear presence, Miss Gant retrieves the mirror, because it proves what she was told, that she belongs to a part of the family denied her. Sprod profits from secrets.
Not antiques. Blee knows too much to ask questions. He stopped.
Added one last line. The town will forgive anyone.
Provided it can gossip first. He folded the notebook away.
It was time to speak with Mrs. Rudge again. She was in her sitting room when he arrived, looking frailer than before, but oddly serene. The space above the mantel weir where the portrait hung seemed to have gathered its own melancholy. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I wondered when you'd come. They say you've recovered the mirror." "We have, madam. It's safe." "But I doubt you'd find much comfort in looking into it again," she smiled sadly. "No, I've seen all I need to. My reflections become a crowded place." Purbright studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Rudge, I believe the mirror was your brother's gift. A family piece, passed to you before the war. When your husband recovered it from Lincoln, he knew that. And when your niece appeared here in Flaxborough, he, or someone on his behalf, made certain her connection would remain unacknowledged." Her eyes flickered. "So you know." "I suspect," said Purbright gently. "Not everything, but enough to recognize kindness disguised as cruelty." She looked down at her hands. "Tomaz was my elder brother. We were close once. When I married, our father disapproved, said the Rudges were too proud and too cautious. Thomas said he'd visit when things settled, but he never did. Years later, I learned he'd a child, Lucy's mother, unmarried. Father called it a disgrace.
I did nothing, she paused, voice trembling.
When Thomas died, the mirror came to me by mistake, or perhaps by justice. I told myself it didn't matter, but it mattered to everyone else. Purbright said nothing. The silence in such moments did more work than sympathy could. That evening, he wrote a short report, official only in appearance. The object described as missing is recovered, circumstances domestic and sentimental, no charge preferred. Below that, in smaller writing meant for no one else, people conceal truth not out of malice, but fear of rearranging their lives to fit it. He closed the folder, took out his pipe, and let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Love entered presently, looking curious. "So it's done, sir?"
All solved?
Purbright smiled faintly. "Nearly. But truth is like a clock, Sergeant.
Even when it's fixed, someone has to wind it again," Love grinned.
And who winds it this time?" Purbright looked toward the window where the last light of day caught the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. Clear, steady, and for once, alone. "I do, Sergeant," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." Flaxborough at dusk was a picture of unrepentant calm. Shop fronts closed like eyes refusing to see. Lamps flickered on with the weary grace of old servants, and the pavements glistened from a drizzle that couldn't quite commit to rain. Inspector Purbright, however, was preparing for theatre, the quiet sort where everyone knew their lines except the guilty. He had arranged, with mild insistence and no explanation, a small tea at Mrs. Rudge's house for 6 o'clock that evening. Present were to be Mrs. Rudge herself, Miss Lucy Gant, Mr. Almeric Sprod, and, inevitably, Sergeant Love, who had been warned to say nothing except what he couldn't help. The parlour was set with modest precision. The portrait of Mr. Rudge looked down with the smug authority of the respectably deceased. On the sideboard stood the now restored mirror, still shrouded in its green damask cloth like a witness under protection. Mrs. Rudge sat very still, gloved hands folded in her lap. Miss Gant fidgeted, pale but composed. Sprod, summoned under the pretext of clearing up an ownership misunderstanding, looked as though his appetite had been misplaced several hours ago. Purbright poured tea himself, with the unhurried grace of a man confident in both information and kettles. "I'm most grateful you all agreed to this little chat," he said, pleasantly. "It struck me that certain misunderstandings might be soothed over a cup rather than a confession." Sprod attempted a laugh. "Always glad to clear the air, Inspector." "Yes," said Purbright mildly, "though I find it's the dust beneath the air that tells the real story." He turned to Mrs. Rudge. "You'll be glad to know your mirror is safe, though I understand it caused you considerable distress before it left." Her eyes met his.
"It did, Inspector."
"But I've had time to remember why." "Ah," said Purbright softly. "Memory, the only burglar we never catch." He set down his cup. "Now, as to the matter itself. A mirror of French manufacture, re-silvered in Lincoln in 1948 by a Mr. Thomas Venn. Your brother, Mrs. Rudge." A faint tremor passed across her face. At the time, the mirror was backed with cloth provided by him, green damask embroidered with his mother's initials. That same cloth was found wrapped round the frame when we recovered it from Mr. Sprod's establishment. He paused just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "Mr. Sprod, would you care to explain how it came into your possession?" Sprod cleared his throat, his voice wobbling like a trifle in transit. "Pure business, Inspector. Miss Gant here approached me, said the mirror was her family's, asked if I'd help retrieve it. Quietly, I agreed, thinking it a private affair."
"I had no idea it would cause—"
"Complications. Purbright nodded as if sympathizing with a stomach complaint.
And how did you gain entry to Mrs. Rudge's house that night?
Sprod swallowed. She'd left the kitchen window unlatched.
I only meant to take the mirror for safekeeping.
Thought I'd spare her the distress of seeing it. Mrs. Rudge's voice, dry as paper, cut across him. You spared me nothing, Mr. Sprod. Purbright raised a hand gently.
Mrs. Rudge, if I may, Miss Gaunt, is what Mr. Sprod says true?
Lucy looked stricken but did not avert her eyes. Partly I asked him to help.
I thought the mirror was ours by right. It belonged to my great-grandfather's family.
My mother told me it was taken from her father's house when she was a child.
I only wanted it back before my aunt sold it. Mrs. Rudge's tone was soft but edged.
And did you truly believe stealing it would right a wrong? I thought it would stop one, said Lucy simply. For a moment, there was only the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Purbright leaned forward slightly, his voice conversational. It's curious, he said, how people talk of objects as if they carry guilt. In truth, they merely carry memory. That mirror has reflected at least 3 generations of your family, Mrs. Rudge, and at least one truth everyone preferred not to see. Sprod shifted uneasily. Love's teacup clinked quietly. Purbright continued. When your husband purchased the mirror from the Venn workshop, Mrs. Rudge, he already knew its origin. What he didn't know was that your brother had left a child behind, Lucy's mother, and that the family had erased her to protect reputation. That is why the mirror was rebacked with new silver to cover the old reflection, the one that still showed her. Mrs. Rudge's breath caught. He told me it was tarnished. Tarnished, yes, said Purbright gently, but only because it remembered more than he wished. Lucy's eyes widened, tears brimming. Then it's true, she whispered. We were family. Yes, said Purbright. Blood and silence, both binding, both stubborn. He let that settle for a moment, then rose, moving toward the covered mirror. And now the small matter of honesty. People say mirrors show the truth. I prefer to think they merely reveal what politeness conceals. He drew back the cloth. The oval glass shone dully in the fading light. Mrs. Rudge, he said softly. Will you look? Her lips trembled. Must I?
Only if you wish to see what remains. Slowly she turned her face toward it.
For an instant her own reflection appeared, pale, age-marked, weary. But beside it, faintly, another image formed, a young woman, smiling softly, as though the glass itself remembered kindness. Mrs. Rudge gasped, hand to her mouth.
Ellen, she murmured.
My brother's child. Then the image faded, leaving only her reflection, tear-streaked but clear. Purbright replaced the cloth gently. There, he said, the past has had its say. It rarely shouts. When the tea ended, Sprod departed first, eager to escape, and later explain nothing. Lucy lingered by the door, her eyes uncertain. Inspector, she said quietly, will there be
trouble?
Only the ordinary kind, Purbright replied. Regret followed by gossip. Mrs. Rudge touched the girl's arm, a gesture small but genuine. You may visit me again, she said. Next time through the front door. Lucy nodded, tears turning to a small smile. Later, as twilight deepened, Purbright and Love walked back toward the station. Nicely done, sir, said Love. No shouting.
No arrests. Everyone went home more honest than they arrived. Only slightly, said Purbright.
Honesty, like reflection, fades if you stare too long. Will you file a report? Of course, said Purbright. It will read, property recovered, family misunderstanding resolved. The rest will live where all Flaxborough scandals live, between teacups and memory. They passed a shop window, its glass dark, but faintly reflective. For a moment, Purbright's face appeared beside Love's, the older, quieter outline of a man who preferred questions to triumphs. Well, Sergeant, he said finally, We've restored a mirror and disturbed a family. A fair day's work, I think." The following afternoon, Inspector Purbright found himself once more in Mrs. Rudge's parlour. The air seemed lighter now, as though the room had exhaled something it had been holding for decades. The mirror still stood on the sideboard, covered again, its presence no longer ominous but faintly protective, like an old servant returned to duty. Mrs. Rudge sat by the window, the autumn sun edging her hair with silver. Lucy Gant sat nearby, quiet but not uneasy. Between them on the tea-table lay a single envelope. The photograph recovered from behind the mirror's backing, its edges frayed, its truth intact. Purbright looked from one woman to the other. "I thought it best," he said gently, "that you both hear the explanation together. Not because I imagine it will comfort you, but because it may stop others from speculating more inventively." Lucy managed a small smile. "You mean gossip, Inspector?" Purbright inclined his head. "Precisely." He sat, folded his hands, and began, his voice soft, his sentences measured, as though delivering a sermon to the most fragile congregation in England. "When your brother, Thomas Venn, worked as a restorer in Lincoln," he said to Mrs. Rudge, "he took pride in preserving the past, even when the past embarrassed those who paid for it. Among his commissions was a mirror originally belonging to his own family. When it came to his workshop after the war, he recognized it at once. Instead of sending it back through official channels, he re-silvered it himself and added a layer of his own choosing, a second film of mercury and tin. Symbolic, perhaps, one reflection to conceal another." Mrs. Rudge's gaze did not move from the photograph.
"Yeah, he sent it to me afterward," she murmured.
"A gift," he said. "Remind me where I came from." "Indeed," said Purbright.
"And you accepted it?"
"But you were married by then to Mr. Rudge, a man proud of his lineage, conscious of his position, and uneasy with any reminders that his wife's family had, shall we say, less conventional branches. He hung it in your dressing room, where it would do least damage, but he disliked it. Perhaps he saw something in its reflection that disturbed him, an echo of your brother, or of the child your family had chosen not to acknowledge." Lucy's hands trembled slightly. "My mother," Purbright nodded. "Yes. The young woman in the photograph, the one half reflected behind your aunt and uncle, is your mother. Taken on the day the mirror was reinstalled. She must have been there, quietly helping. Your uncle, perhaps without noticing, captured her image in the reflection. When he developed the picture, he saw the mistake. He kept the photograph nonetheless, but later had the mirror rebacked again, claiming the silver had tarnished. In truth, he meant to erase her presence altogether." Mrs. Rudge looked stricken. "He told me it was necessary to preserve it." "In a sense," said Purbright, "he was right. Preservation and concealment often share the same tools." He paused, letting the stillness fill the room. Outside, a sparrow flitted past the window and landed on the sill as though to listen. "When Mr. Rudge died," Purbright continued, "the mirror stayed with you. You never noticed anything amiss, until age and recollection conspired to show you what your mind had buried. When you said the mirror refused to show your face, it wasn't magic or madness. It was memory, resurfacing in the one object that still knew the truth." He turned slightly toward Lucy. "And you, Miss Gant, or perhaps Miss Venn, as you prefer, grew up hearing the other side of that truth, that your mother's branch of the family had been erased, that a mirror once in your grandfather's house had been taken by your aunt's husband. When you came to Flaxborough, curiosity became need. You asked Mr. Sprod to help you reclaim what you believed was yours. To his credit, he acted from greed rather than cruelty, a distinction small but serviceable." Lucy gave a faint, embarrassed laugh. "You make it sound almost kind," Purbright smiled. "Flaxborough seldom produces villains, Miss Gant, only enthusiasts with poor judgment." Mrs. Rudge's voice trembled. "And the break-in at Mr. Blee's office?" "Also, Miss Gant," said Purbright gently, "or rather, someone acting for her. She wanted to know whether the will named any relatives beyond yourself. She found it didn't. And that discovery, I imagine, made the theft of the mirror feel almost virtuous. Lucy nodded slowly. I needed to be certain we weren't taking something she had meant to leave me anyway. Understandable, said Purbright.
Though the method was ill-chosen, he leaned back slightly, his gaze softening.
And that, in essence, is all. No crime worth charging, no villain worth jailing. Only a handful of human beings rearranging the past to make it hurt less. In the process, they made it hurt more. Mrs. Rudge closed her eyes. I would have given it to her if she had asked.
I truly would. I believe you, said Purbright.
But families prefer legends to conversations. They last longer and require less courage. The clock on the mantel struck 4. Each chime seemed to fold the story a little smaller. Purbright rose, replaced the cloth gently over the mirror, and turned to go. At the door, Lucy spoke softly. Inspector, what will people say? He smiled faintly. Something inaccurate, no doubt, but less cruel than the truth, which is all one can hope for. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across Mint Street. Sergeant Love waited by the car, holding a paper bag of scones. All settled, sir? Settled enough, said Purbright. The world's still full of mirrors, Sergeant. They just hang in people's minds instead of on walls. Funny old case, wasn't it?
No bodies, no villains? Purbright looked amused.
Oh, there were bodies, just breathing ones. As for villains, Flaxborough rarely manages to produce any. Merely citizens with overdeveloped imaginations and underdeveloped courage. They drove in silence for a while. The town rolled past, church spire, library, station, the familiar hush of an English evening. Love said, You ever wonder, sir, if all these little mysteries we get actually change anything? Purbright smiled. The tired, kindly smile of a man who knew the answer too well.
Change? No, Sergeant.
But they remind people to look at themselves. And occasionally, that's enough. Later, in his office, he opened his notebook one final time. On the last page, he wrote, The mirror that refused to show her face did not vanish. It waited. All truth does. Then almost absently, he added a final line beneath, Some reflections return only when they are forgiven. He closed the book, locked it in his drawer, and listened to the evening settle around the station. The hum of typewriters, the faint clink of teacups, the low comfort of ordinary life resuming by the end of that week. Flaxborough had already begun to forget its excitement, though the forgetting, as usual, took the form of more gossip. In the tea shop, it was generally agreed that something peculiar had gone on in Mint Street, though opinions differed on whether witchcraft, gas leaks, or continental morals were to blame. At the post office, Mrs. Brindle confidently asserted that the police had uncovered a forgery ring connected with silver polish. Inspector Purbright allowed these versions to bloom unchallenged. Experience had taught him that truth, once explained, merely provoked requests for something more interesting. At his desk, the mirror case had already been reduced to an inch-thick file marked Domestic, Resolved. He was signing off on the final summary when Sergeant Love came in.
Smelling faintly of rain and suspicion. Sir, said Love, you'll laugh at this.
The mayor's secretary says Mrs. Rudge's mirrors to be donated to the local museum. Town heritage, she called it. Bit cheeky, if you ask me, Purbright smiled faintly. Flaxborough prefers its scandals behind glass, Sergeant. It keeps the dust off. She's giving it away, so I'm told. Apparently, she says it's time it reflected someone else's worries. Love shook his head admiringly. You've got to hand it to her. Not everyone can tidy up a family tragedy with that much dignity. Ah, said Purbright. Dignity, and the one accessory no Englishwoman misplaces. He closed the file with quiet finality.
And Miss Gant? Gone back to Lincoln, sir.
Took a teaching post?
Left a note. Says she's grateful for the truth, even if it wasn't polite. Purbright smiled.
That's honesty's first lesson. It never minds its manners. At lunchtime, he wandered through the market square. The air smelled of damp apples and civic contentment. A brass band was rehearsing in the gazebo, playing a waltz that had ambitions above its execution. Mrs. Goodacre, passing by, nodded with the friendliness reserved for minor celebrities. "Morning, Inspector."
Solved any good murders lately?
"Only moral ones," Purbright replied. She laughed uncertainly, unsure if that counted. Further along at the library, Miss Tiddy was lecturing a friend in the returns queue.
I told you from the start it was about love, not theft.
"Mirrors always are," her friend nodded sagely. "Still, I never trust anything that shows me my face before breakfast." Purbright smiled as he passed. Flaxborough was healing nicely. That evening, rain returned. Gentle, forgiving. The police station windows glowed warm against the dusk. Purbright sat by the window, the lamplight pooling on his desk like quiet gold. He reread his final notes, not for accuracy, but for sentiment, as one might glance again at an old photograph. Mrs. Rudge, reconciled. Dignity intact, Miss Gant, restored to name and narrative. Sprod, continues trade in curiosities and selective amnesia. Town suitably entertained, he paused, then added, Inspector, reflective. He smiled at the pun, unintended. Inevitable. Love entered with 2 mugs of tea and an expression of domestic conspiracy. You'll laugh, sir. Mrs. Appleyard's written to the Gazette suggesting the police start a department of moral hygiene. Says you've cleaned up the town's conscience. Splendid, said Purbright. Perhaps they'll issue us with soap, Love chuckled, then looked out at the rain. Funny thing, though. You do all this work, sort out people's muddles, and next week there'll be another. Same faces, different trouble? Of course, said Purbright. That's what keeps civilization from rusting. He sipped his tea. Besides, Sergeant, I rather like their muddles. They make the paperwork more human. Later, walking home through the drizzle, he passed the museum. Through the tall windows, he could see the mirror, newly polished, newly innocent, standing among exhibits of pottery and parish memorabilia. It reflected nothing in particular, just a room, a ceiling light, and a single figure pausing to look. His own. For a moment he saw himself there, calm, ordinary,
unremarkable, and behind him,
the faint suggestion of others, the whole town, its gossip, its pettiness, its kindness. He touched his hat to the glass. Evening, he said softly. The reflection did not answer, but it seemed somehow to approve. The next morning, Flaxborough was itself again, bus schedules late, curtains straight, secrets resting comfortably beneath routine. At 9:30, Purbright signed the last sheet of his report, stamped it, and placed it on the outgoing tray. Then, for no official reason at all, he wrote a final sentence on the bottom margin. Case closed. Reflection restored. He capped his pen, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself the smallest of smiles, the kind that belonged to no audience, and therefore was honest. Outside, the church bell struck the hour, clear, mild, indifferent. Flaxborough went on being Flaxborough.